Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to
Dice in my mind.
I was reading actually today that so I'm up here in the Midwest. Jason's up here in the Midwest. I didn't realize this. Jason knows this. I'm a bird watcher and I'm a big fan of owls. And
Who?
yeah, exactly. So I had to pause at that. How bad is that?
Continue.
No, but there's in our area there. I didn't realize this, but the first nesting barn owls have been sighted. First
Nice.
nest in this area in 20 years.
Oh, excellent.
So I didn't know that.
Mhm.
And it got me thinking about our topic tonight. This is a weird segue, I know. But this idea of how we create, it's almost a piece of world building. We probably even could have gone back and done this as part of our world building group.
Yeah, really.
How do you build nature, geography, nothing abstract, literally just the environment? And what do you do, and how does the environment play into the games, or how do you want it to?
Right.
So, for example, with me, with our game, I built, and you know this because you've seen a map. I've built this so that there are seasons.
Yep.
There are actually more than 4 seasons, and they are not timed in a cyclical way. There are other mechanisms by which the seasons change.
Because it's high fantasy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was my way of introducing this idea of a changing geography and how it affects the different ecosystems.
Right.
But on the flip side, when you and I were talking about this, how do you introduce nature, or how do you handle doing that in spacefaring games?
Mm-hmm.
So this was a great topic. We got talking about this. We've been on some pretty deep discussions lately, which were all fantastic.
Yep.
I would say we would both say needed. We're going to always be talking about things like diversity and inclusion. Everyone should have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
But once everyone has a seat at the table, how do you build, when you go back to world building, how do you introduce nature? And the other reason it came up is Jason, you just came back from I'll explain. You came back, you spent over a week out in the field. And it wasn't your idea, ironically. It was, you were gone. We had some episodes drop. We hadn't recorded. We had a really big recording push before you left.
Yep.
And while you were gone, I was thinking about this, and I wanted to see if there was a way to tie in this idea of what you were, the research and being out in nature and what we're doing and talking about.
Yeah, and I was like, no, that's not very interesting. And then as we got talking, it's like, actually, this is something that comes up all of the time, role playing, and we should talk about it and have some fun. Right. And so like you said, nature is often on my mind because it's a big part of my research, but I spent 6 nights in my tent. You know that tent. We've gone camping and I've used that tent. I spent 6 months, 6 months, too long. I spent 6 nights in my solo backpacking tent out base camping for this study, and it was glorious. But I came back, and as we record now, I came back a week ago. I came back a week ago tomorrow. Wow. And it begs the question, we often take environments for granted, at least I do, when I'm GMing, but whether there's a lot of natural environment or none at all, it's all constructed. It's such a ready tool, like you were saying, to make our games more rich, to make the experience and the imagery of the games that much more realistic. Because if we look at the canons that we love, whether it's RPGing and or movies, You know what? Well, for example, what really to me distinguishes the recent Star Wars work. So the first two seasons of The Mandalorian, the trailer that's out there for the Book of Boba Fett, it's the remarkably rich environmental backdrops, like you were saying before we started recording. It's these ecosystems, and it's like you have a sense of place, you have a sense of world, and I'm really bad at making sure I do that when I GM. But that's what we're going to talk about, right? How to look at this and use it.
Well, and it's interesting because you don't really think about it. Well, let me rephrase that. I haven't really thought about it
Right.
when it comes under the context of when we play spacefaring games. We obviously will, there will be planet side gameplay in ways, or there might be just gameplay in space on stations. But when I started putting together it's interesting when I started putting together the world that we've gotten away from playing because of life and everything, and the fact that we drool when we record these because we're so into it.
Yep.
That's the first thing I hit, because in my head,
Right.
better or worse, I'm just, the nature, the environment, again, the ecosystem, the geography, to me, played a role as a base, literally a foundation of the game. And honestly, it goes back to my days of reading the Dragon's Lance novels. I keep bringing those back up, but that was, they were really rich. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman were really rich in talking about that and building that into the environment. So, but the question I'll pose to you is so, obviously, like you had indicated, and I've known you a long time, nature is an important piece to, one, who you are, and two, a lot of your research. And so when you go to, I just find it fascinating when you go to design or build a game, it's traditionally been more spacefaring games.
Yeah.
And how do you now that we've talked about it, maybe it's a rhetorical question, how do you think about building that in? Even if you wanted to, you may not want to.
Yeah. Well, I think we always have to. I mean, like, I think you and I are in agreement mutually that neither of us has done as well with this as we could and would like to. You've done much better, like you said, because with our D&D campaign, the world you've created literally is fundamental to the story that my character is exploring and walking through. I don't have a good answer for you, Brad. I think part of it is, like, to me, the ultimate landscape, the ultimate environment is being out amidst the stars. I would give anything personally to be able to be out there in space, preferably in a comfortable suit behind a visor, turned away from the sun, where you don't have any shielding, right? Maybe actually I'm being really specific here on purpose, where you don't have any shielding, because if you read some of the interviews with the Apollo astronauts, not the station astronauts, but the ones who were on Apollo en route to the moon and back, when they were away from the Earth, when the sun, moon, Earth were all out of sight, and you read the interviews, and their descriptions of the starscapes are incredible and kind of inconceivable compared to what we can see here. So that said, in my mind, when I'm constructing environments for like a Star Trek game, or I should say a Star Wars game, that stuff is there in my mind, but I've never done well. And I think, like you said, because I haven't until very recently made a mental note, like an effort and awareness to say, oh, wait a minute, this is important. I've done it a little bit, but I get more focused just automatically on, okay, so who are you interacting with? Or like you and almost our friend Brian, right? He's a roll away from this, on our hybrid, currently on hiatus Facebook game, but don't worry, listeners, it's coming. It's coming. Things have been busy.
Mhm.
You're amidst a battle with our pirates, right? And so I've been trying to I described the ships. I sent you drawings that I had found online of the ships, but otherwise I haven't said anything about the Starscape. So like an alternative. So you have in front of you.
Let me interrupt you and ask a question, because
Before I
you've
get into
researched
bizarre.
this, and no, and this is going to come from my area of ignorance. What you just talked about, this is why
We're going to talk about marriage. I thought we were talking about the environment.
yeah, no, well,
Okay.
yeah. No one can see my hand gestures.
That's good. I wish I
yeah.
didn't.
Yeah. Nature. Okay, we're in talking about nature
Mhm.
or the environment.
Mhm.
I never would have thought, can you consider, like you said, being out amongst the stars with nothing really between you and space that would distort
Yeah,
the view? Is that nature?
of course.
Yeah.
Yep.
But again, coming
Right.
from ignorance,
Right.
I don't think about that. I think about trees or desert or snow. Like, we're going to get here, as the time we record, it looks like both you and I are going to get a little snow this week.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
So that's my more basic understanding of what nature is.
Well, and so I think Star Wars does this, and they have from the 70s. I think Star Wars does this particularly well. Obviously, we all know George Lucas is very much was a visual storyteller, right? Now, Star Wars didn't become famous for its dialogue, but
Right.
No,
Yeah.
or even Mark Hamill, complaining rightly so, I think, of I was thinking about this actually earlier today, of one of Luke's lines in the sequels. This is not going to go how you think it will. It's like, did someone actually write that? So not good, but visually, so look at how Star Wars does it. So they hop, right? They're jumping between locales, but they typically are going planet to planet. Typically, when it's the rebels or the resistance or whatever it's going to be called tomorrow, how are they typified? It's very earthy, isn't it? Think of all the places that the rebellion / resistance has staked its
Heaven,
bases.
Hoth,
Right. Now, granted, there's the typical sci-fi trope, like you and I talked about earlier in the week, of, well, this whole planet is a forest. Okay, that's not how science or nature works, but it's fiction, so that's fine. We're also talking about playing games with dragons and hobbits. So, right. I mean, let's just be realistic. But think of the rebellion and the resistance, right? They're going to forest worlds, to ocean worlds, to snow worlds, to red and white sand worlds, but they're all beautiful and they're all natural, and there's this earthy, I don't want to say, maybe not tribal element, but this almost wholesome element in how they're perceived or how they're portrayed. And then when you get to the Empire, and then
I
right,
was gonna jump.
yep,
Remember, now in the Empire, they chased them to these planets. The First Order chased them to create, which is the red sand.
right. But how do we? What are the environments of?
It's cold. It's
Right.
metal, and
All constructed.
except what they did. And there's a story behind it, and I cannot remember it for the life of me. But Starkiller Base was built into a planet.
Yeah.
At the beginning of Rise of Skywalker, Kylo Ren was fighting on a planet to grab the Sith Wayfinder, but
Right.
otherwise you didn't really see much.
And even in those examples, like Starkiller Base, and still there, nature, quote unquote, has been co-opted for the mechanical. Now, I think it's important to say, I think I can speak for both of us when I say we love the visuals of the cold mechanic, right? I mean, oh man, come on. But then you have things like the Cloud City, right? The Cloud City on Bespin or above Bespin, right? Which was kind of it was a crossover, wasn't it? So you have this high-tech futuristic city, or I guess it was a long time ago, but you know what I mean. But it's still rounded and kind of organic looking amidst the clouds, and so it's an interface between the two. Our point, listeners, is just that some canons, some franchises like Star Wars, they really handle the environment well. The Mandalorian, I think, is one of the best examples of any of these role-playing relevant shows using the environment to
New
really show
writers.
things off.
Yeah, I think you have Dave Filoni and
Yeah.
John. Oh, good grief.
Oh, see in your moment. I'm Favreau.
Favreau. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um.
They
Yeah.
they come from other arenas.
Right. Right.
Favreau comes
Good
from
point.
Marvel and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, and they write differently.
Mhm.
They've written nature in. I mean, obviously you can go back to episode 1 with them pod racing on Tatooine,
Mhm.
but the other thing that Mandalorian I found interesting was when it comes to nature, we can't, in my mind, and correct me here, we can't ignore not only the foliage and the environment and the
Mhm.
temperature and all that, but what are the fauna that are involved as well.
Right.
Banthas,
Right.
but I remember Mandalorian, it just the way they approached the natural environment.
Or one of my favorite movies, and I'm not afraid to say it, not role playing, but one of my favorite, and it's relevant, Avatar.
Oh yeah, I
Right.
just watched it the other night. Yeah.
Right. But in terms of talking about leveraging the environment as an element of the story.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, just now flip this around. So because you got us started on like sci-fi and space. Okay, but now let's go into the fantasy, especially the high fantasy. So like we were talking offline a few days ago about this. Let's go to worlds like, well, even before we get to D&D, like if we look at its inception, so we look at the Lord of the Rings, and we look at the whole concept of Middle Earth. When Tolkien wrote it, he was so clearly attuned that each of the peoples was endemic to their terroir, right? To their environment. So, the hobbits who lived in the Shire, and I so like right now I've got Leonard Nimoy singing in my head. If you've never heard Leonard Nimoy singing The Hobbit, Brad, so you've heard this. I've played this for you,
Yeah,
have I
so
not?
I'm having flashbacks to you playing
Well,
this.
hobbits are peace-loving folks, they are never in a hurry and they take it slow. So, it's amazing. It's amazing the depths to which they all sank. Anyways, but my point is that they're right. The Hobbit, I mean, the whole point of the Shire, very earthy, right? Don't even wear shoes. And then you have the elves who live in these majestic cities, but they're ensconced by nature. Nature is present, and then as you move away, like you get to the orcs and whatnot, and then it becomes increasingly mechanical, so to speak, right? And then you get to Mordor, right? And what is this? This is a mountain range, and a specific mountain which is devoid of all life, right? So Tolkien used nature really well to help craft, and for him it was up front as well as in the background. And I think the movies for the most part got that. But then like with D&D, I don't have it. Do you have? I should know better than to ask you, because the default is yes. Do you have the Feywild source book?
I'm looking.
He's reaching over right
I'm
now.
looking.
He's scanning
No,
his.
I do not have
No.
that one.
Well,
No.
that's something you should buy.
Yeah, I'm looking. Yep, I do
I mean,
not have that
can't
one.
you feel the whole HOLE, in your soul, the sense of incompleteness.
Nice try, you jerk. We've already talked about the Feywild book, and I've already got it on my
I was gonna say
my save for later list.
It's only a matter of time. But so like Feywild, so right, this notion that and I believe it's the first time that D&D is really taking on the whole concept of Fey. But which to me is an old woman's name, but that's a different spelling. So they're taking on the concept of Fey, where you have these sprites and other things that are indigenous and endemic. They're like a manifestation of the woods. And let's just, I mean, I think you were getting to this much earlier, and then I'm going to shut up. But some of the fantasy games are obviously much easier to leverage an ecosystem, kind of like you're doing in our game, because they take place because they're essentially Middle Ages, right, in terms of mindset. And so the lack of modern technology means
that's a good point.
But there's a reality. The lack of modern technology means you're never going to be too far away from it,
or unless you like, you know, like
unless it's intentional,
like the way I mean, you sometimes have to fight nature. You're never going to, from this like you said, the middle age type of mindset and ability, you try to survive in nature rather than destroy nature so that you can survive.
Right. And you're never too far away from it, because I mean, you don't, it's not like you're going to get in a plane.
Well, I mean, and you can, you know, you can look at the Sword Coast. I mean, for a while I played Neverwinter Online, which is the online D&D game.
Yeah, talk about these for a while, because we were talking about this offline.
And I, you know, what I remember, I played my character really high. I haven't been on there in probably a year and a half or 2 years. It reminds me of that. It reminds me of EverQuest going back to the late 90s. Lord of the Rings Online. They changed the landscape and the ecosystem and the environment based on the level. So as you would progressively level up, you'd be at your home or central city, and then you'd go out into these different environments based off of your level to, in effect, level up and attain material.
Yeah.
But each of them are different. I remember going to, you know, it was within the Icewind Dale, you know, area, and going into a snow-covered and you know, obviously winter environment where you were fighting off, in effect, giant Yeti. You know, then you'd go to a woodsy environment,
right,
where the elves. So they use environment, and they still do. I look at the books. You know, we could go through even Strixhaven, which is not quite out yet at the time we're recording this.
Yeah.
You know, that's, you know, if I remember correctly, that's kind of driven in a university type of environment, right? That's the first time we're going that way. But you have people, I mean, D&D, I never really got into a lot of this, so I apologize to those of you who are much more attuned to this than I did. They have the different planes of existence.
Right.
Different environments for each plane.
Right.
I think of, and it might be my ignorance again when I look at Pathfinder. Pathfinder gives us, in effect, a world and an environment, right?
Yeah.
And there's you know, different biomes and so on within it. D&D has really, I think it's really beyond what Pathfinder has.
Maybe beyond what anyone else has, to be honest. In 5e, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, you can pick the type of environment, whether you want to play in a pirated environment. I know Pathfinder has some of that too.
Yeah, but to your point, I'm just interject, but and that environment ends up being crucial to the game, even if it's just in the background, like you were talking about, right? Because you've got the Feywild, you've got just examples, you've got Wildmount, you've got the Sword Coast, you've got Icewind Dale, right? Just looking at a map of Sword Coast, it's like, whoa, every one of these environments is fairly unique and puts parentheses, if you will, around your opportunities for playing there.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest. At a very simplistic level, if you were to pick up any of those books,
Yeah.
they will traditionally have obviously adventures and background information, but they also have and they introduce new character archetypes,
Yep.
material, and everything that is related to that environment.
Right.
You know, so even when I played Neverwinter Online, when they brought in Acquisitions Incorporated, when they brought in AI
Yep.
to
Yep.
build, it was built within the city, but
Right.
it was a very comedic,
Mhm.
as much as you can be, very comedic environment
Oh, yeah, I think it's
With-
fair to say.
within the game that you had to go through to attain the ability to go out and actually function as a member of AI.
Yes.
So,
Oh,
you know,
which gives me a really okay. Never mind. I just
No,
had
no,
an
no,
idea
but-
for an adventure. Okay,
Oh.
go.
but the point being is that I mean, you know, part of that environment, AI is, you know, the comedy, and there was a little bit of nature, there was a little bit of water, there was a little bit of goofiness.
Yep.
But each book, this is I think the allure of the Pathfinder, but now D&D.
Yeah.
Each adventure book, each source book give you like Ghost of Saltmarsh,
It gives you an environment in which to play and explore.
and it gives you material,
Right.
you know, character classes or whatnot
Right.
that you can introduce within that world.
Yeah, which is
So,
just well done. I mean,
Yeah.
man, I'm looking over at my shelf and it's like, maybe I need
Where do
to
you-
pull one of those out.
yeah, and you know what? If we want to do like a dungeon crawl or a one-off games or something, you know, it doesn't have to be a dungeon crawl. You can have just a one-off gaming session and look at where you can go.
Okay, so speaking of going places, so something that occurred to me when you were going through these, and I think this is agnostic to fantasy, sci-fi, sci-fantasy, etc. But I'd be curious what you think in your GMing. I know in my GMing, this is something I have maybe struggled with. So the notion of does the adventure, and I'm not trying to define that like very much, like maybe it's just one session, maybe it's a whole adventure or campaign, I don't know. But does it take place, or does this part take place out there, whatever environment that is, or does it take place in a city? I have dabbled a little bit, like much like you have, like using villages, right? Really small villages where you kind of know what the core is, and you can fudge the rest because it's close. But then like you look at the Sword Coast and like some of the maps I enjoy so much, or Candlekeep, which I love the concept, as I said before. But Candlekeep is a fairly massive complex. So to play in a really built up environment, just to me seems so complex. But maybe it's not. Maybe I'm overthinking it.
I think I'm with you. I think there's a risk of that. I wonder if we talk to, you know, in the future, as we talk to, I wish we would have known this, you know, had this would have been a good question for some of the folks that we've had on previously when talking about DMing. You know, you started out, you know, if we look at your characters in the game I play, we start out in a little town. Everyone there is really, they don't tend to venture outside of their town. Their town
Right.
is their world. By the time we had paused gaming, you had woken up from being within a small town surrounded by forest to a beach with sand.
Not disorienting at all.
No, and then
No.
into a city, a small city, town. I have not built out or introduced this idea of cities. I think there is a risk of complexity because if you think about it, in nature, you can limit your points of focus. You can there's less there potentially. But I think, but
yeah, no, I'm
now
agreeing.
they say
I
this out
agree.
loud, I don't even know if I'm right anymore, because in nature you can have just as many challenges
Yeah.
as you could in a city. It's just the city tends to be more,
It's a lot higher bandwidth.
yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that's the answer, Brad. I mean, maybe part of portraying a city really well is just that fact, that to portray, the density and the potential confusion, and there's more, like, squirrel, right? I mean, there's all that stuff going on. Maybe that's part of portraying it well. Like, I think so, like we were talking about, like we're talking about your character being in a space battle at the moment with 5 pirate ships, right? A couple of which you had hit, a couple of which had hit you, but for very little damage, right? A better job would have been saying, on my end, you drop out, surprisingly of hyperspace. You find yourself amidst a steady star field. There's this bright green nebula off in the distance at Vision's Edge, and really get into that. And oh, by the way, you have a proximity klaxon, which is just going nuts, the red light flashing on your cockpit dash, and you've got those 5 specks of whitish gray. And we could do that versus this. Yeah.
Is there, though, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
is
no.
there a perception that, like you're talking about in space, it could be vastly empty or vastly full?
Yes.
Nature can
thing.
be vastly empty or vastly full. Cities, in my mind, are vastly full. There's really not. I mean, if it's a vastly empty city, then it's really not a city. If you remove all the humanoids and all the creatures from a city, it's still a built up artificial buildings, all sorts of things that where an adventure could be in each door.
I think that Star Trek Picard, toward the end of that first season, really got this right, of portraying metropolitan areas and urban areas in the background with greater density, right? They have the budget for a lot of extras, but if you think about several of the, if you think about when Picard was in San Francisco those couple times, or in Boston, or wherever, in the background, lots and lots of people, right? It looks like you are really in a city, and there's the hustle and the bustle and all of the beautiful stuff of the great cities of the world, or in that case of the galaxy, right? But I think visually, that's an example that comes to mind. I think if you guys listening haven't seen it, it's Picard, just it's worth it for the visuals. It just, right, not when they're on Capellius toward the end and they're meeting the planet of synths, because that's very, that's a colony that's very specific, very Star Trek-y. But when they're on Earth and they have those moments in San Francisco, in Boston, etc., they really get the background right, and then it's juxtaposed with his chateau, right, in France, where it's a much more organic feel, very slow pace of life. And again, not to bring it to Trek, although that is the way of things, but I think that right now, at least recently, has been a wonderful example of really an urban or metropolitan vibe. I'm really curious to see what they do with that for season 2.
That's actually a good point. And you know what would be interesting would be, if anyone out there DMs, I'm going to start looking too. This came to a point where now I have the question of folks is, what is easier to game master, DM or GM? In a city, out in nature, and what's funny is the computer games that I played over the years that were in effect massively multiplayer online RPGs, MMORPGs.
Yep.
The cities were the safe havens, nature was the danger zone. in different areas.
An old trope out of Europe, out of
Yep.
centuries past. Yep.
Yep. So literally, if you needed help, you went to a city.
Mhm.
If you wanted to level your character and do great things, you had to leave the city and go out into nature where
Interesting.
you didn't know what you were going to get yourself into.
Right.
And you might inadvertently walk into a section of that universe, for lack of a better term. I know this is, I remember distinctly doing this at EverQuest a couple times. Walking into an environment that obviously was for higher level characters than my own, you know, and in effect walking in, and I remember that it was along a coastline and it was a bunch of alligators. And I remember walking in it, and back then it would load, you know, so you'd hit a wall and then you'd load, and all of a sudden I load and I realized that I'm getting attacked by a gator already because it was dial up, you know, and there was a bit of latency issues.
Yes.
And he took 2 swipes at me and I was gone.
Right.
So, you know, and it was far from a city.
Yeah.
But now
you
can play the city as
right,
the danger zone, and the country as the safety zone.
Look at games like Android or anything that's steampunk or cyberpunk.
Yeah. And I will say, I'm thinking about this now, and I will be perfectly transparent and say that I wasn't thinking of this as I was doing it. I think some of the game that I built for us was based off of going the opposite.
Yeah, that's cool. Seems that way.
You know, and it wouldn't have been something I would have thought of. It's not something that I consciously was thinking of as I was designing.
It just happened organically, you might say.
Yeah. But it's fascinating. I know we're gonna transition, but
that's why we're talking about this, because these are things that certainly you and I have not really explored in our own gaming.
No, and I think I mentioned this, and we could go down another rabbit hole. We'll save this for another time. But when it comes to nature and the environment where you are gaming, where you are leading a game or being part of a game, you have people who have created these ornate environments on tables at gaming stores and all that.
Yeah.
Then you have folks that are that use Roll20 or tabletop software games. There's a couple that I'm following. One of them, I jumped in on the Kickstarter campaign for. People are finding new ways now in the pandemic, in the post-pandemic age.
We're not there yet.
No, we're not there yet. I would hope, but I'd like to say by the time this drops, we would be.
Not gonna happen.
Not even close.
Nope.
But point being is people are still and will always now play online, even more than before.
Yes.
How do you bring that environment and nature? Because I'm convinced that it would be. You have to have that. That has to be a plot piece, whether it's a major plot point or not. Mm-hmm. So I have not done a very good job of it because it's hard for me to do. You've done a much better job of drawing, but we need to have, I want to have for us, and I know people who are listening would guide me to certain things. I know what they would be, like Roll20 and so on. I want to have a proper environment where I could show the fog of war.
Right.
Try to build what I see in my head in terms of the nature and the environment. We had the town of Tree where there was a big tree in the middle of the town. I couldn't really describe the tree, you know? But
ironically, you described the town well.
Yeah. So
something before we drift over to the GM corner, something I think we just have to at least acknowledge that, because we haven't, is the answer to a lot of the questions we're posing right now, rhetorical or not, is it depends who's at the table.
Yeah.
And I think that's always the case. You and I've talked about this, but it really depends who's at the table. If I can think of playing, like if we were to hypothetically play with some of our friends, some of them would want a lot of environmental information, right? They want a really almost visceral sense of where they are. I mean, I'm like that.
Mhm.
Alternatively, I think of when I've GM'd for my girls and my nephews, they're not at all interested in that. They want, especially my nephews, they want to get onto the pew pew.
Yeah.
Right. And that's all good. But I think so. I think it's important that we acknowledge that we're not totally daft. It depends who's at the table.
What do they want to tend to get into?
The pew pew. They want to shoot stuff, right?
I just want to make you say it again.
I know. Okay. Pew pew.
Okay.
Also
yeah.
baba ganoush.
Okay.
so which is really delicious if you go to the right place. We had some last night, but that's not the point. So I just think that really does matter. It's like any other element of being at the table. We want a GM not just for the story, but for the needs and interests and passions of who's playing, right? Of our players. Absolutely.
I'm gonna end that, and then I'm gonna jump to GM. I think you bring up a great point, because we were just talking about this. Even if you look at geography, biome, location, environment, all of that, you can see areas that have been underused, environments that have been underused. You know, and everyone can have their own opinions on it, but it's just interesting. You're starting to see RPGs come out that are culturally focused on areas because they're looking for inclusion. And I think some of that not only is the people, but there is a component of it to it that's the environment. And I'm in no position to really, it's hard for me to garner the context for it. But and we could talk about this another time. I think we've even kind of had the idea of maybe seeing if we can have some people on. We're building those type of games. And not only are they building them with the characters, they're building them in the environment that they want to play. They want to create an ecosystem to feel represented.
Well said.
So as we move over to, I have two questions. One,
okay, GM corner, here we are.
When I was last up there for the party and everything like that, was there baba ganoush there? Did I have some of that? Did you have that?
Probably.
Okay.
Probably.
Okay. I think so. I think I had some. And then number two,
they do it better than anyone we know.
This is the same group, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Then we did. It was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And then two, what have you been reading?
Nice. That's great. Yeah. What have I been reading?
You just came off the trail, so you're getting back into it because just because you came back from a research trip, that wasn't it.
I mean, I brought books. I was reading them in the tent, and in the chair, and it was lovely. I am nearing the end as of tonight. I'm nearing the end of the third book in Becky Chambers's Wayfarer series. And this one, she set this up differently. And it's really interesting how toward the end she's tying these threads together. But man, I'm already looking forward to the fourth and final book. That's actually not what I want to address in the GM corner, but I've got one other quick thing, but I'm going to bat it over to you. What have you, and then I'll, actually, because I think we're going to end up talking about this for a sec.
I'm going to throw it back. I'm going to throw it.
What have you been reading?
Well, this could be another rabbit hole, so I'm going to try to keep it brief.
Good luck.
I've always enjoyed in various sports in some form as a spectator. I played some when I was a kid, and I was absolutely and phenomenally mediocre at best. But I have found, I've gotten a little tired of football. I've gotten a little tired of baseball. I've gotten into watching hockey.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found hockey. You watch hockey on TV. There's obviously, like with basketball, there's a women's national basketball, the WNBA. Women's hockey is quite popular. They just inducted a woman into the Hockey Hall of Fame, Kim St. Pierre. When I watch hockey, I'm watching a lot. There is a much more diverse group of people playing, commentating, and involved in hockey than I would have even begun to think.
Yeah. I want to
It's
see how you tie this into
so
role playing though.
yeah. So how I'm role playing is, and I haven't we haven't really focused on this, but Jason knows, going back decades, I've always been into dice based
Yep.
sports games,
Yep.
sports simulations.
Okay.
So it's a little bit of role playing, but it's not. And I was really big into baseball for years, and I would in effect reenact or replay seasons or whatever the case is. So I have had this based off of some episodes that you haven't heard yet that you'll be hearing shortly. I've had this itch to roll lots of dice.
Okay.
And so I have been playing a hockey sim,
Oh, interesting.
and rolling a lot of dice and reading up on hockey strategy, because I've never been I played it as a kid because I lived by lakes, followed it.
Yeah.
Always been a fan from the outside, but I don't think any of our core group of friends would ever consider me a hockey buff in any way.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now I can, I watch it. But why I came up in the GM corner is that I have been rolling a lot of dice, but it's not for an RPG.
Interesting.
I've been rolling a lot of dice
Yeah.
and replaying a season from the 60s, from before I was born.
There you go.
So
That's
very odd choice, but I think there is it just goes back to this itch I have for analytics and numbers.
Yeah.
And it transcends work.
Yeah.
I love keeping stats and everything like that. Now,
That's really
that being
cool.
said, I've completely taken us on a loop. You gave me the floor to do my thing. Now I'm giving the floor back because you wanted to hit on something.
Oh, in a loose way, I think it's related. I have found myself. This is the first time in my life where I've like around RPGs where I've had this interest, this curiosity, and it's out of conversations you and I have been having offline, both before and then after I got back from the field study. It is partly spurred by an upcoming interview, our episode 30 interview, but I find myself starting to ponder now. I'm increasingly interested in indie games, and not and that's new for me, right? I'm the guy who played Star Wars, period. That literally was my definition of RPGs. And then, you got me out of that shell, as it were. And now I have too many books on my shelf. Thank you very much. And I'm not
you're
saying
an amateur.
Yep. Well, a fool and his money. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I'm not saying I'm interested in playing the games. I'm not, but like I was saying right before we started recording, tonight, I'm always on the lookout, as I know are you, for RPG resources that are just that may be in or out of canon, but can be really, really fun to read, really fun to think about, and can then inform one or more different games. And I think in part because of our upcoming episode 30 interview, which everybody, we're just going to be honest, just the timing worked out that we recorded it way early, which is actually really neat. And it's going to be a great one. Because of that, and because of the conversations you and I have been having, Brad, I find myself for the first time really curious to start to be on the lookout for more indie-based games that might just serve as really good resources for not so much for the mechanics, but for the storytelling, the immersion, etc. So that's where I am.
No, and that is such a good point, because that's where some of my purchase problems come in, because I don't buy necessarily to play.
Right.
I had a collection of books that I bought to read.
Yes.
And it spurred my curiosity, and ultimately now you do it too. We still read materials. Like we don't have time now because of the projects we have going, and we have to get back to Genesis and Star Trek.
Yeah.
But the Star Trek Modifius is coming out with a Game Master's guide.
Yeah, we're all over that.
Yeah, you and I are both itching for that.
Yeah.
Even though we're not going to play that game right now.
But still. Yes, as a resource.
And
as reading.
And I've read Jeff Ashworth's, both of his books.
Mm-hmm.
I've read them.
Right.
The characters and everything.
They're wonderful.
Yes. And I've picked up some material. You and I talked about this. We'll talk more about that after
in an upcoming 30. Episode. Yep.
But I don't think I picked up some material based off of our interview from episode 30.
Yep.
And am catching up and doing some reading because it is a fascinating perspective. One that I am almost embarrassing. It's almost embarrassing for me to say was one that I was a little too myopic when I was younger, and bucolic and didn't look at those perspectives. And so reading this material, we'll do it. So we'll talk more about that next week.
Next, like I told you before, next Friday, I'm going to go to my friendly local game store, right? The Source here, just outside of St. Paul, just a huge, wonderful place. And they have a wall of great browsing. And I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time or more just browsing and looking for things that are more Indian that I wouldn't have pulled before, that are not in the canons we've been talking about and playing.
I would say, and then I'm gonna zip it. Drive through RPG.com and Drive Through Cards, which is very similar. I think they're both in the same family. They have all sorts of indie stuff out there.
I mean, that's where we're gonna port ours when we're ready, right?
Yeah, and that's where, in all honesty, a lot of my material, jokingly, has come from was PDFs that I've printed, or Drive Through RPG sales where I've picked up lots of stuff, lots of good material that you can use, even if you're not going to use the game mechanic, the material, like you said.
Yeah. All right, everybody. With that, before Brad and I just ramble on for the next 2 hours on what we'd like to talk about, right? What we're going to play tomorrow or not. As always, thanks for joining us. Be well, stay well. We will see you next week.